Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for coming today. My name is Mark Berry. I'm the president here at Schoodic Institute. And Schoodic Institute is a partner to Acadia National Park in management of this campus and on science and education initiatives throughout the park. It's a great honor for us to work with many of you in that regard. And I'm very much looking forward to today's program, opportunities for all of us to connect, learn more about specific projects that are underway, and hopefully plant the seeds of new projects that perhaps have yet to begin. I have a couple other things I want to mention. Today's Acadia Science Symposium is typically an annual event. We are somewhat in an unusual situation this year because last year's Science Symposium was also this year. We're glad to report that it is October 1st and the National Park Service employees are on the job, which means the government is still open today. That's why last year's Science Symposium was earlier this year. We had a little issue with that. Minor applause for Congress, barely keeping things going as they should, right? But on a more serious note, it is great that we have the chance to do this every year. It's a really good opportunity to share and learn from each other. And as I said, I'm very much looking forward to it. For us this year, it's also part of a longer 3-day program. And we have a lot of people here today who weren't with us yesterday, but that was a day focused on art and environmental science collaborations. And tomorrow we have the Convergence Conference, which is the annual meeting of the Down East Research and Education Network, which is a collaborative effort between conservation and education organizations in Down East Maine that Schoodic Institute is happy to assist with and serve as a fiscal sponsor for. And hopefully all of you will be able to stay through the day today if you've registered also for dinner tonight at 6 o'clock. And if you have not registered for dinner, we certainly encourage you to come back for the evening program at 7:30, which is a presentation by George Jacobson, the Maine State climatologist. Before I turn the mic over, I have one other thing I'd like to do this morning, and that's to invite David Mansky to join me up here. Probably most of you know David. He is a long-term director of resource management for Acadia National Park and currently the acting deputy superintendent, but I called him up here today because he's retiring on Friday. And we're sorry to see him go, but we have a card and a small gift from your friends here at Schoodic Institute in appreciation for everything you've done to make this partnership possible and to advance it. So, thank you. And with that, I'd like to turn the mic over to Abe Miller-Rushing, Acadia's science coordinator, who is our first speaker, but also our MC and director of today's program. Thank you, Abe.
You want to give that to? You can give it to Joellen. Well, thank you everybody for coming. This is so, as Mark said, this is our 4th annual one of these, and we really appreciate the opportunity and the involvement of you guys coming. It's a great opportunity for the park staff to hear about the research that's going on, and a good opportunity, I think, for you, for the research community and the students in the community and others to hear about what we're doing with the park. Before I get to my talk, I want to just take care of a lot of logistics stuff. So for those of you who aren't familiar, the restrooms are out and to the right. The women's are on this side, the close side. The men's is on the far side. There are going to be 2 poster sessions during the day, and all the posters should be up right now. And so what we'll do is we'll split it with who's presenting, who will ask to stand next to their posters. We'll ask the odd-numbered posters folks to be standing next to their posters during the morning session, and the even number folks to be standing next to their posters in the afternoon session, so that for people that are asking questions, so that everybody gets a chance to wander around and see other posters. During lunch, so we're going to be taking a little bit of a walk. For those who haven't been, we'll go down to the Schooner Commons. And right after lunch, many of you probably hopefully everybody picked up a data sheet. We're going to be doing some citizen science observations out right by the Schoodic Schooner Commons, which is a part of an ongoing study we have here. So you will all get a chance to participate. And it's completely voluntary, but we'll remind you again at lunch. But just bring those data sheets with you to lunch. And in terms of at the end, we also have an online survey I'll remind you about a little bit later. But your guys' feedback really helps us to improve this in future years. And Mark talked about the evening talk. For those of you who are staying overnight, checkout in the morning is at 10. And for those of you who are looking for transportation back to park headquarters at the end of the day, if you're leaving back right after the Science Symposium, you can see Karen Anderson. And if you're heading back after the evening talk, you can see Judy Hazen Connery. And also, just before I get going, I wanted to acknowledge we have an organizing committee, a planning committee for this symposium. I want to thank the guys who helped out with that. That's Jane Disney from the MDI Biological Lab, Tom Huntington from U.S. Geological Survey, Ivan Fernandez from the University of Maine, and John Anderson from College of the Atlantic, Emma Albee, and Mike Sukup from Schoodic Institute. So thank all those guys for helping to make that possible. Really appreciate it. All right, so are there any questions about any of that stuff? Then we get into the more fun stuff. So my talk is basically giving a little bit of background here. So it's kind of a teaser setting the stage for a lot of the science that you're going to be hearing about during the rest of the day. And so talking about protected area science in a rapidly changing environment. And so this rapidly changing environment is one of our top priorities it is our top priority for science in Acadia right now. A little outline, I'm going to be going through the background and challenges, some about the role of protected areas in science related to rapidly changing environment, and then our approach here in Acadia National Park. And so a lot of times when I talk about rapid environmental change or climate change or anything like that, people ask about whether these kinds of things have happened in the past or point out, is it unusual? And for sure, rapid environmental changes have definitely happened in the past. Sometimes they can be catastrophic and lead to mass extinctions and things. And so it's definitely, there's precedent for rapid environmental change in the past, but it's also happening right now, even though it may not look it. It was interesting, a couple weeks ago I was out with a reporter from the Boston Globe in the park, and we were standing on top of Cadillac, and he was asking, how would this have looked different 100 years ago, since we're talking all about this rapid environmental change stuff? And you know, there are some things that are obvious, so that there would have been more farmland, and the forest is closed in some. But those aren't the changes that we usually talk about when we're talking about rapid. Oh, they're part of it. And there was the fire in 1947 on Mount Desert Island, and you can see some of that. But a lot of the changes you can't see. A lot of them are pretty invisible to a lot of the public. And so a lot of the changes that we were talking about on our walk, you really can't see very much. So changes like the warming temperatures. This is from the National Climate Assessment, what the warming that's expected in the next 70 years or so is roughly the same as the warming that's happened since there was a mile of ice on top of where we're standing right now. And so that just kind of puts it in perspective, but it's hard to see. And it's hard to see the mercury pollution that's happening, and so this is another part of the rapid changes that's affecting our fish and other wildlife species in the park. And that's been a subject of a lot of research here and ongoing. And it's hard to see actually a lot of the changes in the flora and fauna. So roughly 1 out of every 5 of the plant species that were here 100 years ago aren't here anymore. We've had big changes in the insect community as well. Big changes in the bird community also. And these are things that as you're walking through the park, you still see green, you still see wildlife, you still see these things, you still see the pristine looking lakes and water, but you don't see these changes. But they are happening. And but the fact that they're hard to see makes it difficult to communicate. Or adds a little bit of a challenge. But how do we protect these resources in this changing environment, and kind of what role does science have in this? And so it's good to then asking those questions to go back to kind of what our mission is. And you guys are all very familiar with this, but preserving unimpaired the natural cultural resources in our national parks. And historically, that's in the distant past in the Park Service, that was interpreted to mean preserving these vignettes of primitive America. And in the past 30 or so years, we've been in the process of reinterpreting that, how to manage for change. And about 2 years ago, there was a report, there was a science advisory group to the National Park Service that put together a report revisiting Leopold. And they articulated this kind of re-articulation of the goal for the Park Service. And I'll let you guys read that. And so I think that this is a nice articulation of our goal in a changing environment, kind of the managing for continuous change that is not yet fully understood. So accepting the fact that there's uncertainty and accepting the fact that the environment's changing. And then that kind of requires a rethinking of how we do science and what kinds of contributions science has to our understanding. And so the way we're, at least in their current stages of planning for science here, focused on understanding the changes that are happening, the causes of those changes, the consequences, and the appropriate responses to those changes. And so that's a lot of stuff that gets wrapped up in there. But that's what we're really focused on in terms of the science going on here. And when you get down to the appropriate responses, there are a couple of things that happen there. So there's appropriate responses. So there's science that can inform what we can do as a park ourselves, and we can go in and restore vegetation or remove invasive species and do other things like that. But a whole lot of our appropriate responses are going to be influencing the actions of other people, whether they're other federal agencies, EPA, setting down regulations that help clean air here, or influencing the behaviors of people in the communities around the park, or the people who are emitting fossil fuel emissions or other things. And so that requires communicating the science that we're doing and engaging the public and improving science literacy, helping people to understand the science that's going on here and what we're discovering, and then also trying to improve environmental stewardship and civic engagement. So there's this kind of basic research, but also engaging and communicating that research to the public is an important part of it. And so protected areas have a really important role to contribute, in part in terms of the science to understand change, because we have large protected landscapes that have been relatively undisturbed, compared to a lot of other areas for long periods of time, and they provide pretty secure research sites. And we also tend to have historical records beyond, so protected areas tend to have more research and do a better job at archiving and keeping the research that's been going on in these areas. And so these historical records can be used to document changes, and this is herbarium specimens collected on Mount Desert Island, kept in our herbarium at College of the Atlantic. And We also have an interdisciplinary mission and staff and partnerships. And so this is a good example, our annual BioBlitz. We have people that know how to have fun, that we're going to miss coming up before long. But the BioBlitz is a great example of we engage different partners, so the Maine Forest Service, the Maine Entomological Society, the University of New Hampshire, University of Maine, and others to inventory, to engage volunteers in inventorying insects here. So to look at the changes in our insect community, to engage the public in doing that, and to engage partners. And so it's a really nice, we're really well positioned to kind of do this kind of research, which is important in this kind of, in a dynamic, changing environment with complex interactions. We also have a lot of expertise, and this is kind of a restatement of that last slide, but connecting science with management and education. And so protected areas, by and large, have staffs that do interpretation and education, have staff that do resource management, as well as engage with, if they don't do research themselves, they can engage with partners that do research. We have access to visitors and community members. And so 2.5 million people come through Acadia roughly each year. And so we're generally viewed as honest brokers of information to these guys. We also have gradients, whether it's inland or coastal to inland, or elevational gradients that can be used for space for time substitutions. So when you want to identify how things are likely to change over time, you can look at lower elevation climate, compare that to higher elevation climate, and that'll tell you potentially how those higher elevations, which are cooler, will look like in the future. Okay, so you can use these kind of gradients that exist in protected areas. And we can also scale up. So Acadia is one protected area, but this is a map of protected areas across the country. And so we can take research from one place and apply it to a lot of others. And so our approach here in Acadia, we're working with the Schoodic Institute and Friends of Acadia on a project to really restore natural resilience so that the idea is to remove impairments, so focusing on a single watershed. We're starting with the Cromwell Brook watershed in the Sourdemont area. This is a photo of Great Meadow, which is in that watershed. And restore natural resilience, and the idea is that so that when disturbances happen, that the system can bounce back. Right now, there are a lot of invasive species, there's impaired waterways, there are a lot of problems that species have to deal with, in addition to the things that, that would make it harder to bounce back from changes in climate or other things. So we've set some goals here in terms of what we're aiming for with this changes in looking for improving resilience. We're aiming to manage for clean water, natural flowing streams, healthy forests and wetlands, sustainable wildlife management, balance with natural and cultural resources, which is a key part of our mission with the Park Service, and the sustainable facilities and the community engagement. And we're also going to be taking an adaptive management approach, so this is important, going from conceptualizing the problem, and I'll come back to this a little bit, but planning the actions and monitoring, taking a very deliberate approach, planning, implementing, analyzing what's going on, capturing and communicating the things, and then doing this in a cycle, so we're kind of learning as we're doing. And right now we're focused on tackling these obvious problems first, so we're kind of, I'll go back to this, we're taking a very quick and dirty way of getting right from here to here very quickly. Because some of the problems are really obvious and don't take much thinking. We have impaired waterways, let's fix that. We have invasive species, let's fix that. We can have areas where there's needs for restored vegetation and to stabilize erosion and to mitigate pollution is coming from things like our septic system. So we're connecting that to a sewer so that we won't be polluting that watershed as much anymore. But then importantly, we're going to be monitoring the responses to this. So we'll be looking at changes in the fish community as we replace these culverts, how they're moving, changes in water quality, and changes in the vegetation community too as we're removing invasive species. And we'll be doing this using an integrated approach with both professional research So we'll have professional researchers and students out there, but as well as volunteers doing citizen science. And this is done more rarely than you would think. And so when I talk about citizen science, and whenever you hear citizen science here, it is not just an education thing. We're getting real science. We're doing it for a reason, getting information out of it to help us manage things. And then kind of going back. So we're doing that kind of quick and dirty side of getting from the conceptualization of the problem to the implementation. But at the same time, we're kind of going back and making sure we really understand what's going understand the system in the Cromwell Brook watershed and throughout the park. So we've digitized 3,000 documents, our history of research in the park, which you can now find online. I encourage you, there's a poster about how to get that information that Emma Albee has in the poster session. And there's been a resource assessment done so that you can find out what the status of our various resources in the park are and what our current knowledge of the threats in the park are. And we're about to undertake an effort to develop conceptual models of our systems, of the freshwater systems, of the marine systems, and of the terrestrial systems in the park. And the idea here is, so this is an example from the delta around the San Francisco area, where the idea is these conceptual models help us understand how the things like water chemistry, so this is one for riparian vegetation, but it assesses how things like water chemistry or different animal species, disease, fire, climate, all these different things interact to affect the vegetation. And so we're going to be developing over the next year or so conceptual models that help us understand how processes happen in our systems, that'll help us to, one, from the management side, it'll help us identify what places can we plug in our management to have most effect on our goal down here, right? So we're going to be developing these kinds of models, and hopefully next year we'll have at least hints of new knowledge on this to share. And we'll be able to modify these, so these won't be static. These will be things we'll be revisiting a lot over time. And the idea is that we'll be, continuing around this loop, so that as we develop these conceptual models, we'll be able to come and plan new actions, implement them, and then continue to refine the models. And the idea is that this science symposium going in the future can be an opportunity to revisit and say, what have we learned? How can we change those models? And how should that affect what we're doing on the ground in terms of resource management? And of course, we want to be able to communicate this and consistently communicate this and engage the public in the work that we're doing. So that they're up to speed and feel very much as partners in the project that we're doing. And again, to reemphasize that many of our management, in many cases, our main management technique is to influence the behavior of people outside of the park, so that they're not planting invasive species in their yards and other things like that. And another thing that we want to do is as we're doing those conceptual models, developing those conceptual models, we'll identify gaps in our current knowledge, so where we need to fill in. And some of these things we already know very well there are gaps in our knowledge, and one of them is for instance, bats. We know, actually I think Bruce can correct me on this if I'm wrong, but I think we know a lot more about bats in Acadia than most places in Maine, but we know very, very little, even in Acadia, about our bats, although we do know that we're losing them. And so this is one of our important get bats, and that Cromwell Brook watershed is important bat habitat in the park. We also know very little about how ocean acidification is affecting the estuaries and intertidal zones at the bottoms of these watersheds. And so we'll be wanting to fill in gaps on that. And we have a research project that just started this summer here on the Schoodic Peninsula with citizen science volunteers and led by John Sigliano, who's looking at the effects of ocean acidification on periwinkles and crabs and the predator-prey interactions. And we're looking at species interactions as well. So it turns out that one of the biggest, most sensitive responses to climate change is changes in the timing of things, and that's altering these species interactions, and that when there was a literature review done just recently and looked at what looks like the main drivers of declines in population size as a result of climate change. And the main one they have evidence for is primarily these species changes in these species interactions, whether it's between predators and prey, or plants and herbivores, or plants and pollinators, or between interactions between species and their physical environment, so water resources and things like that. But we don't know. So historically, we haven't had monitoring programs looking at these species interactions. And so we're just starting up. And this will be some of what you do right after lunch, is the beginnings of a program here to look at these species interactions so that we can start getting a grasp on what looks like one of our most significant vulnerabilities to climate change is these interactions. And so I think this is pretty close to one of my very last slides, but we're going to be trying to pull together a lot of the data that we're collecting. So one of the things that we do very well is we collect a lot of data. So we have an inventory and monitoring program. We have a lot of researchers. We have, I think this year we had, 72, correct me if 72 or so research projects going on in the park, in the field this year, creating a lot of data. And so what we want to do is take at least some of these key data sets and integrate them, and so that it's easier. I think my understanding from a paper this year is that over half of the research time of researchers is spent just managing the data. So formatting it, getting it so that you can get it into your statistical analysis package. And so we'd like to make that a whole lot easier for you. So we actually have a workshop happening next month with a corporation, EMC, it's a cloud community corporation, to help us think about how we can do this. And then use those data to more easily get into these conceptual models, reevaluate our resource and threat assessments, get into the research out there, and then also to inform our resource management, science, and communication plans and actions. And then just to bring it back so that we're doing all this to really try to restore the natural resilience of the park. And after we're done, we're never going to be done. In Cromwell Brook watershed, after we feel like we've got a good handle on that, we can repeat this in other watersheds throughout the park, such as in Marshall Brook and Northeast Creek or Otter Creek or Stanley Brook down here. And then we can also, once we have feel we have a good handle on this model, we can repeat it in other protected areas across the country, or work with other protected areas across the country to repeat this kind of thing. So I think that's it. So I want to thank you very much for your time, and really appreciate it. Do we have time for questions? Or yeah? So if there are any questions. If you don't mind being patient and waiting for a microphone to come to you, it's just so everybody can hear.
Jack Russell, Friends of Acadia. Abe, inspired by your last slide, can you identify the one or two most important hypotheses that science in Acadia is pursuing, for whom and with what potential consequences?
I would. It's a good question. So there are. I'm not so sure I want to say the most important. I could say some of the important ones. There are a lot. And I would say that one of the ones that I personally am passionate about, and a lot of people hear me hammer on this a lot, but it's certainly not the only thing, is with citizen science and the integration. So this is kind of a methods hypothesis, that you can integrate citizen science into the kind of basic science and interpretation and education programs within a park to have meaningful science, contributions to science, and interpretation and education outcomes. And so that's not been done in most, I think anywhere. And so I think that that's one. This kind of the watershed project in the Cromwell Brook watershed is another kind of just big hypothesis that we can have a meaningful impact on the ability of that ecosystem to bounce back from disturbances. And that'll be one that we will be able to test over time. So I would say that that's kind of another grand experiment that we're kind of undertaking.